So let's talk about requirements. As I might have mentioned earlier, requirements is the riskiest part of any project, of agreeing what it is that we're building and agreeing on a schedule on what it is that we should. If we agree on what it is that we're building, what should we build first? Right? Agreeing that resources are scarce, resources are limited, and that we are, we're humans. We don't necessarily understand exactly what we're going to be doing, and given that those constraints, and the fact that the business certainly will want everything, and will be very very reticent to give a priority for them. Everything is important. It is our business to make them understand that there's a limited time, limited resources. What would you do if you had one thing to do? What would you do? And so it is our responsibility to push them, to challenge them, to decide what should we do first, right? And so that we have at least a core set of functionality that if we run out of money and time, well, at least we have that, right? At least we've done something that is valuable. So requirements, again, it's the riskiest part and the most costly if you get it wrong. Right? The longer you take to come back and fix something that you might have not understood in the requirements phase, the much more expensive it will become. It is often that as developers, we as geeks, we love technology for technology's sake. Not for any particular problem. We're oftentimes dazzled by the things that you could do, and we're not so worried about the things that have to be done or the things that need to be done. There's plenty of problems out there, but we're more interested on the solutions than the problems. So we go ahead, start working on something, and I'll go find out what it is that we're going to be doing. Oftentimes we do it backwards. We love to just code and get at it. If we feel that if we're not coding, somehow we're wasting time. Right? That we're not using our time efficiently. And we often are we have kind of these discussions with our clients on that I need to know what it is that we want to build, and this kind of captures this where I need to give me the requirements. It says, but yeah, I need you to build the thing that solves my problems. It says, well, you need to tell me what the problem is. And it says but if I can't tell you what the problem is until you tell me what you can do. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg here, right? And says, and you gotta get frustrated. So we could build anything. Imagine there was no limitations and we could build anything. What would it be that you need me to build? So this says, well, what can you build something that comes up with the requirements? If you could build anything, right? Do you have a mind reading machine that can figure this out? Certainly, there are several techniques for managing projects that we already covered, and they all seem to follow this sequence of events, right? Where there's a lot at the beginning, a lot of communication, a lot of meetings, a lot of brainstorming, a lot of interviews, then some analysis and design analysis, figuring out what it is that we're going to build, and the design is how we're going to build it. A lot of planning, agreeing on a schedule, whether what is that we're going to build first. If there's several phases, we'll focus on a first phase of a 3 months window, and then after that, perhaps phase 2 and so on and so forth, where we have a first a minimal deliverable piece of software, and then we can come back a little later. So we plan out and do estimates. We go off and do modeling, create data models, class diagrams, sequence diagrams. Now we've talked about the limitations of this technique, and certainly we've talked about improvements on this idea of tightening the cycle, right? Of iterating multiple iterations that allows us to quickly change course if we know more about the domain and we need to change. But but still the deliverables, kind of the deliverables of each one of these phases, whether it's waterfall or whether it's agile, are somewhat similar, right? You still, in the first phase of communication and gathering requirements, nevertheless, you're still gathering use cases and describing in detail what are the steps that somebody is going to follow to achieve a goal. And oftentimes we refer to this as a user-centric design. We center the user at the center of the universe, and from their point of view, what is it that they're trying to achieve, right? And we ask them, we might follow them, we might shadow them, we might look at the different forms that they're filling out, all the screens that they're interacting with, and the question is always, what are you trying to achieve? What is that you're trying to achieve? They might get lost in the detail of filling out a particular individual input field or clicking on a particular button. But it is what we're trying to find out. What is their goal? What are they trying to achieve? Not necessarily on the minutia. We might provide a different set of buttons and fields and screens. And it is our responsibility to document what are their goals. Who's trying to achieve this, and give them names, give them well-documented names on the use case. Typically we identify in a summary, maybe a sentence or two, that we give a very very short description on what is it that the person is trying to achieve, who the person is, who the actor is, some preconditions on what is it that we're already assuming. We're assuming that the person has logged in, they have an account, they have perhaps they have already searched for a movie, and they're looking at a list of movies. Maybe that's a precondition, right? And then the steps that they might follow to perhaps review a movie, right? Is that they actually select the movie, they look at they're presented with a form where they can type in the review. They type it in, they select a rating. They select a thumbs up, maybe they bookmark it as well, and then they submit their review. And then the post condition is that perhaps they see the results of having submitted this. Maybe they would be allowed to edit it again, or they would see maybe their review as part of a long list of reviews for that movie, perhaps, right? That might be the post condition. Additionally, there might be exceptions. Typically, you describe the happy path, right? If nothing goes wrong, this is what would happen. These are the steps that you would follow. Each one of these might have exceptions, things that could go wrong, that would be listed, perhaps alternatives, right? Like A, B, C, D, and maybe you've already reviewed the movie, or maybe or can't find that particular title of the movie, right? Or maybe you search for something, but you have now not just one movie, but you have 20 movies that match your title, right? So there are other exceptions that don't meet your happy path, right? That also need to be documented, your alternate scenarios. Now, depending on whether this is a waterfall or this is agile, typically the level of detail to these kinds of documentation might vary. Okay, if you're in a waterfall, these typically are very very detailed. Right, waterfall typically is very heavy on documentation. Everything has to be known at priori before we start coding anything. In an agile, perhaps this is not as hashed out. Right, maybe some sentences here and there, and the actual details would be documented when you're actually going to implement it. Right, when a particular feature is selected for implementation, then the business owner and the analyst might sit together and okay, let's document this, how this should actually work. Right, perhaps the business analyst already has done some priori filling of some of the details, right? Some sketches here and there. Again, in Agile, it's not heavy on documentation. You only document when you need to document, when something's not understood, right? Only for communication purposes, but not for the documentation per se. the importance is to use this as a communication tool. So one of your first assignments will be to create these use cases following a template that we've provided. I believe there's a PDF that is linked there. And I think it closely resembles this. It has different sections. Not all templates are the same. There's quite a few versions. There's a couple of standard templates. Typically, a company will have its own templates of documents, and they'll adapt them to their particular process. And we're asking you to use the template that we gave you, but if you feel comfortable using another template, that's fine. Anyway, so based on the project that we're working, you'll create templates. You'll fill out these templates. Typically, you give a name to the use case. Usually the name is like a verb phrase, right? That I'm searching a movie, right? Or it could be a client adds an item to their shopping cart, or a fan likes a movie, or a fan reviews their favorite movie, or whatever, right? So you name them as a verb phrase, and then describe their detailed steps. Right, so it's for communication purposes. So what is a requirement? So requirement as a has several formal definitions, but it's basically a feature or condition or behavior that we expect the application to have, and it's formally, we want to formally document it so that we're all reading it and we all agree that that we understand it the same way, right? As opposed to having informal discussions. Typically, these requirements they all get started by from the beginning by having lots and lots of brainstorming sessions with quite a few folks that presumably represent the interested parties, and they all will have different points of view, and they're usually they could be very vociferous, and typically you would have a moderator an experienced moderator that makes sure to keep control over this large group of folks, just yelling out multiple things. And these moderators typically will go out and collate and aggregate all these ideas, right, and try to make sense out of them. Typically, these requirements are these brainstorming sessions are followed by one-on-one interviews or small, more focused subset of teams, right, where you can have follow-up discussions in much more detail, or also follow up by observations. Folks are going to be either business analysts are going to be following around people that are representative of the users, right, and jotting down the things that they're reading, the screens that they're filling out, the forms, the reports that they're reading. And that's a very it could be a very awkward position. Folks don't like to be followed around. They might feel that they're in jeopardy. Their job might be in jeopardy. That why are you measuring how long they take to do this or whatnot, right? And they might actually behave differently when you're looking at them, right? When you're observing them, so perhaps you might get some skewed results, right, as you follow them around. So typically you try to randomize your sample and follow some different folks at different times of the day, different times of the week, just to gather some of this notion. And so this body of requirements, it's very common that you have conflicting requirements. Right, and it's our job, as IT professionals, to point these out and challenge our stakeholders on them, right, and fully document them and validate them, and make sure, as a developer, that at some point you can actually code and write a piece of code that validates that requirement has actually been met, right? That if you can't code it, then there's no way to validate or measure your progress for a particular requirement. So these requirements typically follow a very formal a syntax where it's very clear what when we talk about the system or the actor and the kinds of things that are required. We're saying it's the system must do this or shall do this or shall not do this, right? Almost like a legal terms, right? So I mean, it is contract, right? We are agreeing, two parties are agreeing that this is what we're going to do. This is what you want, and I'm going to commit to delivering this, right? Agile and different methodologies treat this document a little bit differently. In Waterfall, it might be an actual contract, right? That this is exactly what we're going to expect, and there'll be money would be at stake, right? That if you achieve certain things, you will get paid, right, according to the certain deliverables, right? Agile is a little more open-ended. We see it as a milestone that you've achieved, right? That we are at a level of confidence that we can actually start building something, right? But we're all in agreement that this is a living document, and as we progress through the process, we might learn more, and things might change, right? And we're all open to change. And so it's a little different the way you treat these. Again, but they are nevertheless documented in a formal language. The assignment shall be due on the date assigned, right? And again, to be as clear and unequivocal on what we mean by assigned on a particular day, a particular hour. Depends on the domain. How granular do you need to be about the intent of the requirement? If it's an assignment, maybe I do need to know if it's at the beginning of the day or by the end of that day, right? End of day, end of business day. Again, just examples on how English is a poor a tool for communication that leaves a lot of ways to interpret the same sentence, right? Depending on how you parse it, how you interpret it, and so we just have to be mindful that these things are going to happen, and just do some use a technique that will allow us to come to a consensus that we all agree and we all interpret in one way. We did talk about software disasters. There's tons of these. History is littered with these disasters, and we have a very poor track record at actually delivering something that we had actually agreed on, that the client is actually happy about what they got. And so we're only here to see if we can improve our success rate. He's the Affordable Care Act is one of the big ones that recently, right? Was obviously the Denver airport. We talked about it last week. Requirements is where a project is most vulnerable, and we definitely want to make sure we improve our performance. So requirement is a set of commitments that the client and the development team comes to an agreement, and the risk is that we understand it differently, and folks will point out a lot of risks throughout the beginning of the requirements phase. It might be a new technology that we would like to try out. The tech team wants to try out this new thing called React. Nobody really in the team knows anything about it. Well, that's a risk, and nobody really knows about NoSQL, non-relational databases, but we still want to try out these new things. Well, so that's certainly a risk, right? And so many folks in the stakeholders will point out multiple risks, right? And that's one of the things that we need to take into account. And what's the probability that a particular event will occur, and also if it does occur, well, what is its impact, right? If it does occur, how bad would it affect the project? And we kind of score the different types of things that could go wrong, or things that could go right, and their overall impact, right? And also decide, what are we going to do if those things actually occur? Are we going to try and invest all our effort to try to just completely avoid the event from happening, or can we mitigate it somehow? Can we maybe transfer that risk to somebody else so that if that happens, we're not affected, but maybe our vendors are affected, or someone else not us is affected. So there's a lot of discussions early on about all the risk factors. Once we have these requirements, is the client willing to stay engaged in the process, or are they going to come in and give these requirements and then just be unavailable for the remainder of the project, right? So that we can't validate, we can't demo, we can't get feedback. So certainly there's lots and lots of risks. A lot of them perceived, a lot of real risks, and we need to annotate them and just make sure that we are mindful of those risks. Right. So requirement analysis is a process that we agree on the what. On the what is it that we're going to be building. Typically, design is kind of okay, let's agree on how we're going to build it. What technologies we're actually going to be building. What stack. What techniques. So design is the how we're going to be building. Right. The instantiation of that solution. Right, and they're all intermingled and part of an ongoing process. Right, so the classical point of view that typically leads to the waterfall methodology is that everything needs to be known a priori. Right, that's very, very hard. We've already mentioned this, right? That there's no way for us to know exactly everything. How's it going to go? There's several techniques by which that we use to iteratively come up with increasingly more detailed requirements. Where you start off with the low-hanging fruit, perhaps. And focus on the core set of functionality for the project, and as you iterate, you take on new features. You divide it into multiple phases that each phase presumably will give a new value to the product, and at each iteration you refine the requirements. You create prototypes to test out some ideas, to test out things that might be risky, that we don't know how a particular service is going to go with a new vendor, or a new relational database that we might be using, or the team doesn't know anything about React. Let's prototype a couple of things, and so we feel comfortable about a particular new technology. And once we prototype it enough that we have some confidence, right, we can then go on to the next phase. Typically, prototypes are thrown away. They're only useful for learning and making us more, making our guesses a little more educated. You declare new tasks for the next iteration. They become issues to be solved in the next iteration. Stakeholders are an umbrella term that captures all the various folks that are involved anybody who's interested in the well-being and health of the project. It might be certainly the business owners. It could be certainly the CEO or any sponsors that are putting up the investments. Right? Certainly they're stakeholders. Typically, they come only at the beginning of a project. Right? They come in, they bless it, and then they go away for most of the time. and then they might come in towards the end just to see the end product. But certainly we have more stakeholders that are committed and involved throughout the process. Certainly multiple managers, multiple VPs, multiple folks at different levels of the organization are participating. Certainly any outside entity that also can be affected, any partner that we're partnering with, any legal institution or financial institution that we need to deal with. Certainly the end users, right? They're part of the stakeholders. So anybody who has any interaction with the system is considered to be a stakeholder. Certainly that. Oftentimes we forget some of these stakeholders, right? We're thinking about most of us developers were thinking about the system just running on our machine, right? We forget that at some point somebody needs to deploy this on a real environment, and that needs to be operated from day to day, right? That has to be maintained. Machines have to be serviced. Databases need to be maintained and whatnot. So certainly the operators are also part of the stakeholders. Right? Any political, financial, social folks that might benefit. Anybody who has to buy the systems and procuring it. Any regulatory entity, financial, that we might be interacting with. Yeah, anybody who interfaces with our system, we consider them to be stakeholders. Yeah, so eliciting requirements is the first part, and we'll start, I think maybe next week, where you're going to start eliciting requirements from us, from all the instructors. And so we'll run, typically the second half of the week, we'll run these sessions where you will come with questionnaires, questions for us on the details of this project. Okay, and we'll be, the instructor will be playing the part of the client. Okay, and oftentimes we'll play the part that we don't know. We'll give you some contradictory answers. Okay. And it's your responsibility to make me see where my contradictions are, right? And how what alternatives might be to resolve those contradictions. Okay. The other sessions in the week we'll be running sessions and actually developing it or designing it, right? Or creating some data models for representing these. Representing the data storage for the application, but yeah, so these requirements elicitation part will be running it here in class. We might also run it in some of the labs. If you can interview also the TAs themselves, that are also going to be versed in the particular project that we're working on, right? So they also will be the representatives of the stakeholders, right? So in this case, it's all the instructors plus the TAs are going to be the stakeholders, okay? And you'll be asking us for details on the project. It'll be kind of at first it'll be somewhat like a brainstorming session where we're going to just throw out a lot of ideas here and there, and as we progress, we'll try to organize them into actual use cases and data models and prototypes and user interfaces and services and whatnot. Okay, but right now we're in the section where we're eliciting the requirements. Again, the most common or the most requirements elicitation strategy is to do an interview, right? Where you meet for 20 minutes, 30 minutes with your stakeholders, and you just have a conversation, right? Some of the conversation could be open-ended, right, unstructured, or you might come in with a very structured questionnaire of things that you'd like to point out. Usually, the first set of interviews are very open-ended, right? Since we don't really know. But then consecutive interviews can become much more structured. Right? You have more specific questions. These interviews even though it's the best way to get information, are typically very, very expensive, right? I mean, obviously not in this particular case, but yes.
So on the first day of classes, you said that you and the other two professors are our clients. Is there like a formal way to set up interviews with you, or is the process going to be different for us since we're in class?
We're going to try and run them here in class. So towards the maybe 3 to 4 weeks, the second half of the week are going to be working sessions. Right. So we'll run sessions where you ask and whatnot, right? And then we'll break out into smaller groups or in your teams, right? And then we'll come around and have one-on-ones with each one of the teams. Yes.
For this first project proposal,
yeah.
That we're doing, that's due next Friday.
Yeah.
We're not going to have a lot of time to talk to you between now and then.
So this is going to be your interpretation of the requirements that we gave you, which has been given to you. So out of that document, you would come up with your own description and also the use cases from there.
Okay, so you're not expecting us to go
No.
deeper individually?
No. Right. So there are multiple. There are actually multiple elicitation strategies. Right. Brainstorming certainly is one of them. Sending a form to fill out is also a very common. It's very cheap. Right. You just come up with a questionnaire online and send it off to someone, myself, the TAs, anyone, to fill out. Even though it's very cheap, the response rate tends to be very low. Well, not us, right? The TAs are going to answer, and myself are going to answer. But normally in normal projects, folks either just never get to it, never answer it, or they will answer just a few questions, but not everything. Also, they're also very dependent on how you phrase the questions. For instance, if you have open-ended questions, where you might expect a paragraph or so, they're very time-consuming to read from your point of view, right? And trying to extract the information that you want. You have to parse what I wrote, what the client wrote. Whereas if you send a questionnaire where you fill out from 1 to 5, right, or maybe a multiple choice, or a value, an actual value that you can give, those are much easier to tabulate, right? To create a spreadsheet, and you can run analysis across multiple folks that have answered the same questions, right? So there's many types of questionnaires that can be very useful to gather an initial set of requirements, and then you can follow them up with interviews, to follow up with more explicit questions. So interviews certainly are the most popular technique, but those tend to be very, very time consuming, right? And oftentimes the folks that you're talking to have extraordinary salaries, and their time is very, very expensive. So an hour with them, you're wasting a lot of money right there in their interviews, especially if you have these sessions where you where you have a lot of folks meeting for a whole week, right? In these requirements elicitation forums, it's your responsibility to organize it, right? To rent out a place in a hotel, perhaps, big meeting rooms, and set up all the desks and all the computers and all the projection screens, and yes.
Whose responsibility is it to develop this?
No. The business analysts and the product owners, right? That are either it would be a team that is an inside team part of the organization, or it might be a firm that that you contract out. And so typically these are very expensive endeavors. Folks need to perhaps fly in from internationally or from across the country. And then you have to house them for a week or so. You have to feed them. There's going to be events that occur, and so it's typically you want to make sure you have an agenda and you have clear goals that you want to achieve for those 4 or 5 days that folks are there. And so in those requirements elicitation meetings, right, you might have also the IT folks there, right? that are listening to all these brainstorming sessions, and they're ready to generate a whole bunch of prototypes, right? And put in front of the audience. Hey, you've been saying all these things. How about this, right? And they put it up for folks to look at, and folks can vote. Folks can vote on the merits of one prototype versus another. So it's a very interesting, very time-consuming, very expensive endeavors. These requirements elicitations, but it sounds it's a very, very hard to do, and like any human endeavor, right? Right. So one of the hardest things is to come up with the scope, right? What are the boundaries out of all the things we could possibly do? I mean, the business should feel that they could do anything, right? Here's a pie in the sky that we could possibly do, right? But then you start to consider all the constraints, the money and the time and the many of the things that impinge on what actually can be done. But ideally, you have a vision of what it is that you want. But then reality has to set in on what is it that we can deliver in the next month, in the next 3 months, in the next half a year or a year or so, right? And so defining what the scope, what the boundary of what is that here's the universe and here's what we're going to be doing within that context. Recognizing that no one person understands the whole vision, and that it's a collaborative, and that things are going to change over time, and folks are busy, right? Certainly we want to involve the client, but the client can't be involved because they live across internationally, or they're flying all the time, making actually running the company. And making, bringing in money, right? They're busy, right? So availability is certainly a risk factor. So there are different types of requirements, and depending on who you talk to, they'll give you different levels of abstractions of different types of requirements. If you talk to the CEO or the business owner, they'll give you, very abstract, visionary types of requirements, right? That are based on perhaps on the day-to-day operations of the business, or certain things that they might want to improve. And typically those are business requirements that they're not listed here. They might want to increase sales, they might want to reduce returns, they might want to increase their engagement with their clients. So they might have very broad types of requirements. Ideally, those requirements will match with user requirements, here represented as use cases. Use cases are from the folks that are the end users of the product, right? The folks that are actually going to be clicking and dragging and typing and actually using the product from day to day. And they might have their own gripes, right? They might have their own points of view and things that they hate about the product, things that they think could be better. And ideally, the business requirements somehow match the user requirements, right? And certainly is our responsibility as the IT folks or the business analysts and the product owners to validate, between these requirements that they match, right? This is what the users want, but they're not represented in the business requirements, right? Something is wrong. The business wants to do something that does not fulfill what the user wants, right? So somehow there needs to be consistency across all these types of requirements. So the use cases will be from the point of the user actually using the system, what is it that they want. Typically those use cases or user requirements are represented or implemented in functional requirements. So functional requirements is where we come in, right? As the developers, right? It's the instantiation of the user requirements, right? The user requirements might be somewhat vague. They might be they might be explicit on how to achieve a particular goal, but they don't explain whether you're using a screen or 3 screens, or what forms are you using, what input fields are you filling out, right? They don't go into that kind of detail. Whereas the functional requirements might going to there, right? So they might start looking at some wireframes, right? And splitting up, really long forms into maybe into a wizard, right? Where you go through several, the defined step level screens, right? So that's where the functional requirements come in, and they start, implementing tangible things you can actually touch and interact with, right? And then you might have other intangible requirements, non-functional requirements, that deal with aspects of kind of quality of service that the application might give you. You should allow 10,000 multiple users using the same system, right? So that would be kind of a non-functional requirement. You can't touch it, you can't see it, right? But the application feels snappy, right? It's quick. It doesn't crash on me. It looks pretty, right? So it's usable. It's understandable, right? So all these are intangibles, but certainly, they are measurable, right? Certainly, you can measure how many times it crashes, right? As a percentage, how many multiple threads are running at the same time, how many connections are running at the same time, right? You can kind of measure the health of the system, and so those would impinge on what or on the umbrella of non-functional requirements, quality of service. Certainly constraints in time and financial constraints and your different business rules about that certain things have to happen during these office hours or after hours, or depending on customer loyalty, they get discounts. So all these rules, right, would be part of the constraints. Also legal constraints, right, or community constraints would be part of those types of requirements. And in this first phase, you're going to be focusing on this part, the use cases. You're going to be working on use cases for the project, the movie social network. Okay. Types of requirements. Oh, okay. So there were actual slides for these. So functional requirements. They're very specific about particular thresholds, about particular features that it needs to track, so again, this is following the formal syntax of using shall and shall not or must, right? Non-functional. That it needs to do 40 cups of coffee per hour, right? So that it's accessible in English and Spanish. Constraints, a lot of these might be very arbitrary. That we need to be ready to go by Christmas, right? It has to be deployed. I want to make sure we hit that buying spree season by Black Friday. We need to be up and running by Black Friday. So some of these requirements might be written in a very formal, almost legal language about certain things that we know we have to hit. Your telephone system must be able to handle 97,000 calls per year, a growth rate of 15% annually. Telephone system must be able to support an 800 number. So that's kind of like a functional requirement, and the other one seems to be a non-functional requirement. So these contract style, ideally they're formal, they're precise, they can be validated, whether what kind of progress have been made towards that they can be actually measured, presumably even tested on the side. I can write an actual test that validates that I've achieved this particular requirement. Some contract style that will have some legal or common language that must not have, may or may not. Yeah, so avoid avoid doing something like every single we interviewed the hundreds of users and we turned all the suggestions into features. Certainly, we'll come back to this a little later, but there's no way to make everybody happy, right? There's no way that every single user that to design the software that it will be for everybody, right? Usually, we will have a particular focus in our company or a product where we hopefully our 20% of effort hopefully will solve 80% of the problems that of the folks of the audience that we're trying to target, and that we should not even try to make everybody happy. There's no way that we can design a system that can fulfill everybody's expectations. So use case. So let's talk about use cases. We need to write in a formal syntax what it is that certain folks, what are the goals for certain folks, right? And we need to go to the stakeholders, the user stakeholders, and say what is it that you're trying to achieve. That usually we won't be asked that way in a formal sense. Typically, it will be it will come natural as you either in the interview process or as you follow them around and you observe them from day to day as they do things. When you follow them around, sometimes it's very challenging since they might not do it exactly the same way every time, or certain things you have to make a lot of decisions on how you're going to fulfill something. It's your responsibility to capture and document what their different goals are and the various scenarios that describe step by step what is it that they're doing, right? Or how is it that they would achieve those goals. You want to describe the boundaries of the system, who are the actors, the stakeholders, their goals, and how the system fulfills those goals. So here's an example of a system that implements a video surveillance set of cameras that you can install in your house, right, or in your business, where it describes the use case that display camera views, and it identifies the actor as being the homeowner, and they want to interact with the system. Ideally, they would have a way for selecting or seeing the multiple cameras that are currently connected to the system. Perhaps select an individual camera, perhaps pan the camera left and right. Maybe if it's on a recording system, maybe they might be able to rewind and fast forward and pause the video. So this one in particular says from the point of the user, if I'm a remote location, I can use a PC with a appropriate browser to log on to Save Home, to a website where the recordings are being done, enter their user ID, password, I log in, and then I can select a particular camera, or I can look at thumbnails from all the cameras, right? I can then maybe choose one of them and zoom in into that particular camera. So a scenario of displaying all the camera views might take this open-ended prose, right, and try to write it in a much more set of bullet points, right, that are much more formal, right, following a much easier to read and much easier to understand, right. So the homeowner logs in, homeowner enters their ID, they enter their password, they display all the major functions, they select a particular camera, right. So this is certainly much easier to consume, right, by a developer than this one, right. This might be left for interpretation, right. Might be vague, might be contradictory. So it's a responsibility as a business analyst to take this, right, and convert it into something that is easier to consume, that we can hand off to a developer, to a design team that can look at this and says, okay, well, let's start mocking this up. Let's create a couple of prototype screens, right, and let's let's put a couple of buttons and here on the left-hand side, maybe a menu at the top, maybe a footer at the bottom, and prototype it, and then give the client a first approximation of what do you think about this, right? So for this first assignment, you'll be creating use cases in this fashion. Right, we need to take into account alternative actions, right? Typically the use case will first capture the happy path, right? If we have all the information in our hands and we can answer all the questions, what would the steady state behavior of the system would be, right? But we have to take into account that the user will certainly run into unexpected issues, right? And we have to document them, right? If there's an error condition or different paths where they have to make a decision, right? And you go one way or another, and they need to be also documented as part of the use case, right? So in this case, here's a formal example, an actual example from Safe Home, the use case of accessing the camera. Here's the happy path. Homeowner logs in, enters their ID, the password, and whatnot. They can look at the floor plan, but then you have exceptions on and how they would be handled, right? If they don't have the ID or the password, or the surveillance function is not configured, or the homeowner selects a thumbnail and it says view thumbnail snapshots for all cameras, or the floor plan is not available, or the alarm condition is encountered. So all of these would be declared and as part of the happy path, either separately, right, or it could be embedded, as sub-steps of an existing step. So you could have 5 and then 5A, 5B, 5C, displaying all the exceptions, right, for a particular step. Right? Somewhat like a pseudocode, right? Not following any particular formal representation, but it's for documentation purposes. It should be enough for a developer or design team to go off and start, coming up with some prototypes. Yes.
So it's kind of like a user's manual, except you're not giving it to a user, you're giving it to someone.
For a developer. Yeah, you're documenting. Well, we don't have a documentation just yet. That will come. And certainly the documentation folks will take this as an input to write them. Although it'd be a little bit too early since there is no actual user interface just yet. So the documentation folks will come last. They're the ones who have a big challenge, because if you change anything, right, any user interface or any behavior, right, they have to rewrite their entire documentation. So documentation before the product even exists. So here's a particular template, right, from this company, Safe Home. This is their template, right? So internally, this is what they use, right? This is the way they format their use case. Right? And again, each company will have their own way of documenting use cases, right? We're giving you a template, right? And we're hoping that you use that template, or if you feel comfortable using a template that you're already familiar. I see some folks here that might have taken maybe 3500 or where we go into much quite a bit of detail on documenting these things. So if you have experience doing that and you're familiar with other templates, then by all means use those templates. Okay? But this is just one of the templates used by Safe Home, where to declare the name of the use case, accessing the camera, the primary actor as a homeowner, the goal, the content, the preconditions. So presumably the system has been fully configured and already has an ID, already has a password, right? And also a trigger. What is the event, right, that causes this use case? So within these state, this event causes the this event to be in effect. The homeowner decides to take a look inside the house while away. So from outside, presumably they can log in and see their video feed from remotely. These are the happy path scenario, right? And then the exceptions. Here they're documented separately, but they could also be documented embedded for each one of them, for each one of the steps. Right. So be skeptical as a part of our responsibility is to always challenge the business folks, right? The ones that are giving us our requirements, whether we actually need to do that. We challenge with just like the 5 whys technique, right? That we ask them, they tell us they want something, and then we ask them why, and they explain why, and then we give them why again, right? And then they maybe a little more detailed, and then we ask them why again, kind of like what is the first principle, right? What is it behind it? Oftentimes, you come to the conclusion that maybe it was a very personal thing, something that we thought that it was a very wide and applicable across the company. It actually turns out to be something very narrow, that it only applies to that particular person. So it is our responsibility, without being disrespectful and without making it uncomfortable for them. We have to challenge. We have to challenge. Is this real? Do we really need to do this? Is it complete? Is it? Can we even do this? Do we have the technology for doing this? Or if we proved it for 10 folks, is it scalable to thousands of folks, right? Is it even feasible? Can we verify? Can we validate them? Between them, are the different types of requirements, business, functional, non-functional, user requirements? Can we take any one of these requirements and make sure that they're represented across all types of requirements, right? That they're not contradicting each other, they're not conflicting with one another. The job may never be done, right? So a lot of the upfront effort of eliciting a lot of these requirements might not even be used ever, right? It's so common that a lot of products end up being something completely different from what they originally were. The inception was. They spent all their 80% of their efforts in tons of features that nobody uses. Instead, something that this little feature over here, this little button that they almost was an afterthought, turns out to be what the clients navigate to, and that's they love that particular feature, right? And not until it's out there and folks are actually using it do we actually know, right? That's what they wanted in the first place, right? And that could feed into a next iteration of a new version of the product. Okay. So let's take a look at some of these PDFs.